we're going to spend some time learning about the questions on the science exam that require you to analyze and interpret data. Now, this is a very important topic for you to be familiar with because you're likely going to see between 19 and 22 questions on the science test that require you to analyze the data found in a passage. In other words, almost half of the questions on the science test fit into this category. So if you struggle with this type of question, then you're going to struggle with the whole science test. In this lesson, we're going to review several strategies, however, that you can use to help you answer these data analysis questions and hopefully improve your score on the science exam. There are actually two different types of data analysis questions that you're going to have to be familiar with on the science test. First of all, we have data interpretation questions, and then we also have inference questions. Let's begin by discussing how to work with data interpretation questions on the science exam. Now, there are usually more questions of this type on the science exam than any other. You'll likely see around 14 to 16 questions of this type. So it would behoove you to become very good at answering this type of question. Data interpretation questions require you to read and then analyze a scientific passage that contains data in the form of text, a table, a chart, or a graph. Now, before we go any farther, please understand that you don't actually have to understand the science behind the data displayed in the table, chart, or graph. You just need to become very good at finding the appropriate information within that chart, table, or graph. Even if you have no idea what the table, chart, or graph is actually talking about, that will probably be the case. So, to find the answer to a data analysis question, you need to do two things. First, you need to read the question itself very carefully. Why? Because you need to be sure that you're looking for the correct information within the passage. Here's a warning. The exam authors like to be tricky in the wording of these questions. So be sure you know exactly what the question is asking you to find. And we already talked about how to do this in a previous lesson. Second, you need to very carefully analyze the data presented in the text, table, chart, or graph to find the answer to the question. Let's take a look at an example. First, let's talk about reading and interpreting data from a graph. Now, to do this, we're going to use the same experiment that we analyzed in an earlier lesson. Probably the most important skill you need to have when interpreting a graph is knowing what it is the graph is actually trying to tell the reader. On the science test, you should see that each graph, chart, or table has a legend of some sort that tells you exactly what's being displayed. In this example, notice that the left side legend tells us that we are measuring how much biogas is being produced, and also notice that it tells us the unit of measurement. We're measuring the volume of biogas produced in milliliters. That's very important. Remember, the questions on the science exam will sometimes provide answers that include the correct value for a question, but using different units than what's shown here on the legend. So be observant and be ready to convert units if necessary. We talked about how to do this in a previous lesson. Also notice the legend over here on the right. This legend tells us what treatment was being applied. In this case, it tells us the amount of time that a container full of manure was agitated to produce a given amount of biogas. Notice down here we have 4 groups. This is our control group. It was agitated 0 minutes. This group was agitated 15 minutes. This group was agitated 30 minutes. And this group was agitated 60 minutes. If we actually read the experiment, we'd see that that agitation occurred every 48 hours over a total of 20 days. So in this example, if we needed to know how much biogas was produced, if we agitated a container for 60 minutes every 2 days, we would locate the 60-minute column right here, and then we would note its value. Notice that it's slightly over 4 milliliters. Now be aware that you may see many different types of graphs used on the science test. The graph we were just looking at was an example of a bar chart. You will probably also see line graphs used on the test. Now in this line graph here, notice that we're measuring the temperature and volume of 3 different gases: oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. So suppose we're answering a question on the science test and it asks us to find the volume of nitrogen at 80 degrees Celsius. To do this, we'd identify which line is nitrogen. It's the orange line with the triangle, and then we would just follow it to 80 degrees Celsius, and you can see here it's about 8 milliliters. Now, in addition to graphs, you'll also probably be required to analyze data from tables on the science test. Now, this can be a little bit trickier for most students as opposed to interpreting a graph or chart because the data isn't represented graphically. It's just a bunch of numbers. To do well in the science test, you need to be able to look at a table and quickly analyze the information that it's trying to convey. Let's take a look. Here's an example. Notice that this table displays a lot of information, and it actually takes a lot more effort to read and process as compared to a chart or a graph. Once again, the first step is to use the table legend to identify what's being conveyed. Notice here that we're measuring the volume of biogas produced after a specified amount of the amylase enzyme has been added to a container full of cow manure. Now, even though tables aren't as fancy as a chart or a graph, they do have a couple of advantages. One of the key ones, in my opinion, is the fact that they do allow you to find specified data points really quickly as compared to trying to chase it down in a chart. For example, suppose we needed to know how much amylase would be required to produce 3.4 milliliters of biogas. All we'd have to do is look at this entry right here. We see we have 3.36, and we see that to produce 3.36 milliliters of biogas, we had to use 50 grams of enzyme. Therefore, we would know the answer to the question would be around 50, probably slightly more, like 52, 53, 55, somewhere in that range, to produce 4 milliliters of biogas.